Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here today at Morphy's with all three patterns of Portuguese Army Luger, and so we are going to look at each one of these in sequence. Portugal, like many countries, was investigating self-loading pistols in the late 1800s and early 1900s. They specifically set up in Lisbon a little commission, 5 officers, who were testing and experimenting with automatic pistols from the late 1890s until 1904. Now, these guys got their hands on a Borchardt Luger, the early name for the Luger pistols. In 1901, they did a bunch of testing and evaluation, and they decided, yeah, this is definitely the best one of the bunch that we've come across. And in 1904, they unanimously recommended it to the Portuguese Army, which proceeded to not buy any because they didn't have any money to work with. So that kind of went nowhere. But another commission was formed in 1907 to do essentially the same thing. That commission also recommended the Luger pistol to the Portuguese Army, and this time they went ahead and bought some. They in fact bought 5,000 of them. So let's take a look at one of those. The Model 908 was really a gorgeous example of early military Luger production. So it has a 120 millimeter barrel, or about 4 3/4 inches. It is chambered for the 7.65 millimeter Parabellum cartridge, which is essentially identical to 9 millimeter Parabellum, just necked down to 7.65. It's a good cartridge. Doesn't have quite the, contemporary military forces decided that the 7.65 didn't have quite the stopping power of the 9 millimeter, and so most people ended up transitioning to 9 millimeter eventually. These Portuguese Army pistols have their own unique serial number range from 1 up to 5,000 that you'll find on the frame, as well as having the last couple digits marked in a whole bunch of other places, as was typical on the Luger. These guns are equipped with the grip safeties. They do not have shoulder stock lugs, but they are new model Lugers. So coil mainsprings, the full-size checkered toggles. For more substantial markings, we have a DWM fancy script logo on the toggle, and then we have this really cool crest. This is the crest for Manuel II, who was the King of Portugal when these guns were adopted, and not for very much longer. His father was a longtime king, Carlos I, and Carlos I was actually assassinated in 1908, the same year that these guns would end up being adopted. His son, Manuel, was a young man at the time, having just entered the Portuguese Naval Academy in 1907. That, of course, changed. He was crowned king after his father's assassination, and he would end up being overthrown by popular revolution in 1910. So he was king of Portugal for all of 2 years, but long enough to get his crest onto one piece of Portuguese military hardware. I like the fact that they have the Arabic digit 2, numeral 2 there. When you see something like, a king's name written out, it's virtually always identified in Roman numerals, a Roman numeral 2. But no, this crest has the Arabic 2. It's worth pointing out briefly, there are 2 different styles of this crest. There were 2 stamps that were used by DWM. They are essentially identical. If you put them side by side, you can notice a few differences. But if you are a serious collector looking for a Portuguese M908 Luger, and you find one and you think the crest doesn't look quite identical to this one, well, not all of them were. Those 5,000 Manuel II pistols would hold the Portuguese Army pretty well for a while. But in a couple decades, they did find themselves needing some more pistols. Not the Army specifically, but the Portuguese Republican National Guard. They're going to need some more guns. Now, this is an organization, it's a National Guard sort of organization, staffed by a lot of ex-Army officers, and most of these guys are just armed with for sidearms, they just have the Luger pistols that they brought with them from their Army billet. They just kept those guns. But the Guard does need some more guns, more than just what its officers have brought in with them. And so in 1935, they place an order for 564 new Luger pistols. And by this time, they're not buying them from DWM. Now they're actually buying them from Mauser, because Mauser started producing the Luger pistols after Versailles in the interwar period. Now these guns, despite being made nearly 30 years later, they specifically order exactly the same pattern of guns that they originally got from DWM. So these are commonly called the GNR pattern of Portuguese Lugers, and we have one of those we can take a close look at. Despite being ordered from Mauser, of course, the GNR guns, which is here, are set up with exactly the same configuration as the original M908 Army Lugers. So we still have the 120 millimeter 7.65 millimeter barrel. We still have grip safeties. We still don't have shoulder stock lugs. Mauser did not put these in a unique new serial number range for the Portuguese. They are in the V prefix series. So they will run from the low 1900s through 2500 V. And that'll be marked obviously on the frame as well as the barrel. Note that we've got a proof mark up there. The V only appears on the frame. On the rest of the parts, it's just the number itself. Serial number on the barrel extension with a German proof mark. 27 here is, again, the serial number, the last 2 digits of it. And these guns, instead of a DWM toggle, of course, they were made by Mauser. They have a small Mauser banner logo on the toggle. They do have another really cool looking crest, though, a very fancy GNR, again, for Guarda Nacional Republicana, for the Portuguese National Guard. And by this point, they have added a fancy feature. We now have a safety marked in Portuguese, as well as that same loaded chamber indicator marked in Portuguese. So they actually made this even fancier than the original 908s by adding that safety marking. The Army itself would end up needing more Luger pistols. World War II breaks out and everyone kind of gets a little bit worried and starts rearming a bit more. And Portugal was on good terms with Germany, and Portugal was actually getting quite a lot of small arms from Germany. They would get various machine guns, they got K98K rifles from Mauser, and they decided that they also wanted to get almost another 5,000. They wanted another 4,578 Luger pistols. But it's the middle of World War II. This is 1942. And they're not really in a position to be able to make all sorts of special requests like they did with the GNR guns about, ooh, we want our Portuguese labeled safeties and we want this essentially, by this point, obsolete cartridge and the long barrel length that you're not making anymore. No, they get whatever Mauser is actually producing, which is essentially German Army P08s. And so the third and final pattern of Portuguese Luger, the Model 943, M943 for its date of delivery to the Portuguese, was identical to the German P08. And I can show you this one. The spirit of the M943 Lugers is essentially, I would say, fine, we'll sell you some guns, but look, we're in the middle of attempting to conquer all of Europe, and so we can't afford to make you that fancy custom stuff you had before. So how about a P08 Luger? If you want a Luger, you'll get a P08. Here you go. Hope you enjoy it. These guns got assigned serial numbers just straight out of Mauser production. This is actually a very early one. They run from approximately 150 M up to approximately 5,330 M. Not quite all of those guns, but that's the range where you will find the Portuguese M943s. The toggle marking is now BYF, Mauser's factory code. And instead of any of those fancy chamber markings, now you get 42, the 2-digit date. These guns were made in 42, delivered to Portugal in 43. And everything else, like the safety markings, for example, is totally standard German. They're marked P08. They have Waffenamt WAA 135 Eagles on them. The only thing that separates them from German production guns or German accepted Army guns is the lack of a final acceptance proof mark from the German Army and their serial number range. So black plastic grip panels, I should point out, black plastic magazine. Now, originally, this gun would have had a finish typical of Mauser at the time, so it would have been a blued gun. However, after Portuguese service, or in the course of Portuguese service, a bunch of these were given this really heavy sort of matte Parkerization finish. The guns were sandblasted prior to this refinishing, which is why some of the marks, like those German Eagles, are pretty faint on this one. But the Portuguese put these to use in places like their Angolan colonies, and the guns saw very hard service, and so a bunch of them got an Arsenal-style refinish, like this one. The Luger really was a tremendously popular pistol worldwide. Early on, it was one of the first truly efficient, effective, reliable self-loading pistols. Yeah, the C96 Mauser beat it by about 4 years on the market, but the C96 was truly the old style of pistol. The Luger was a gun that really meets the handling standards of a modern pistol even today. Yes, its mechanism is obsolete today. It's overly expensive to manufacture, but in 1900, 1905, the pre-World War I period, the Luger had very few serious competitors for a military service pistol. And that's reflected in the fact that so many different countries both bought them and actually stayed with them for, typically speaking, about 50 years. Countries that got Lugers tended to keep them until after World War II, like Portugal did here. Now, I do want to point out there are a couple other Portuguese Lugers, specifically ones that were purchased by the Navy. Basically, every time the Army bought some guns, the Navy also bought some guns, and they have markings that are a little bit different, and they were purchased in far lower quantities. We're talking about 10% as many Navy guns. So, at some point, I will get my hands on a couple of Portuguese naval Lugers, and we'll show those to you as well. But for the time being, I think it's pretty cool to be able to put all three of the Army patterns together in a single video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.